The Seahawks didn't make any moves with Geno Smith last week, allowing his base salary for 2024 to become guaranteed. But does that mean that the Seahawks aren't exploring a quarterback in this year's draft? Looking at the hires, that might not be the case. I'm going to be breaking it all down on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to each and every one of the 12s that are tuning in on this Thursday afternoon, whether you're in Sumner, Washington, or overseas in France. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Seahawks announced a number of coaching hires. There's also been a few that have been reported on Mike Macdonald's staff. I will be diving into that later in the episode. And what I've been advertising for the last few days, it's time to take a deep dive into Ryan Grubb's run game and what to expect as the first-year offensive coordinator gets ready to take over in Seattle. It's a jam-packed episode coming your way, courtesy of FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. As one of the big dates on the calendar for the Seahawks this offseason, they didn't make any moves with Geno Smith last week, allowing his base salary to become fully guaranteed. So at least for the time being, number 7 is still on the roster, expected to be Seattle's starting quarterback for a third straight season. But the team can still move him before March 18th, and whoever trades for Geno Smith would accept his base salary. So the Seahawks can still save a bunch of cap space and make a big change at quarterback if they desire to do so. Keeping that in mind, looking at Seattle's coaching staff right now, Mike Macdonald has done a really nice job, at least in my opinion, of putting together a staff that's got a nice blend of experienced coaches and young coaches. Now, he's got 3 first-time coordinators at the NFL level, but as I'll be talking about later with Ryan Grubb, we are talking about a guy that's been a play caller for a long time at the college level, has had a great deal of success. Same with Jay Harbaugh at Michigan as the special teams coordinator there. He has had some outstanding special teams units in Ann Arbor. And Adam Durde, first-time defensive coordinator, but he has been in that position before, coaching over in London. He's been working with linebackers, defensive line. There's a lot of intrigue with this group, but something stood out to me yesterday with the report that former Arizona State offensive coordinator and Boise State offensive coordinator as well, Zach Hill, was going to be joining the Seahawks staff as an offensive assistant. Hill coached Jaden Daniels at Arizona State for 2 seasons. Daniels began his college career in Tempe as the starting quarterback before eventually transferring to join Brian Kelly at LSU. This marks the 3rd assistant coach that has been added that has either direct or indirect links with one of the top quarterback prospects in this year's draft class. Now, take that for whatever it's worth. It could certainly be a coincidence. It may have very little to do with what the Seahawks are looking at from a hiring perspective. At the same time, you have an offensive coordinator in Ryan Grubb who had immense success the last 2 years at Washington with Michael Penix running his offense. J.J. McCarthy at Michigan. Jay Harbaugh got a firsthand look at that as the special teams coach. Mike Macdonald was there the first year McCarthy was on campus for Michigan as the defensive coordinator that year. So there's a lot of familiarity with what he is able to do. And then Jaden Daniels, who I believe has a chance to be a top 5 pick in this year's draft. The Heisman Trophy winner, beat out Michael Penix, had 50 total touchdowns this year. For the Seahawks to be able to get him, I think that they're going to have to trade a bunch of picks to be able to move up. I don't see him being a player that's going to fall to them at number 16 overall when you look at the production, the dual threat capabilities. But still, you are talking about a quarterback that you now have a coach on your staff who had direct work with at Arizona State in Zach Hill. And that was part of the development process. Now, Jaden Daniels took a massive step when he went to LSU. So maybe you don't want to give too much credit to Zach Hill as his original offensive coordinator and quarterback coach at Arizona State. At the same time, he still had really solid numbers with the Sun Devils, and bringing him on board, it gives you another coach that has direct knowledge, has intel that a lot of other teams in the league are not going to have, whether it's the quality stuff or maybe Zach Hill's got some intel that maybe would suggest the Seahawks shouldn't make a selection of Jaden Daniels if he's available. But they now have 3 coaches on this staff as assistants who have these close relationships with quarterbacks who could be in play in the first round. In particular, I think McCarthy and Penix are the two to look most closely at because, again, I don't see John Schneider giving up a couple of future first-round picks and moving a bunch of other draft choices, trying to move up into the top 5 to get Jaden Daniels unless he just absolutely loves him. And even then, that seems like that is way too rich, especially without a second-round pick this year from the Leonard Williams trade that happened back in October. It just seems to me like it's really unlikely that Jaden Daniels is going to be in play. Penix and McCarthy is the one of those two that I'm most skeptical about being there at 16, but it's possible that these two could be there. And when you look at the numbers, they didn't have quite the incredible overall numbers that we saw from Jaden Daniels with nearly 4,000 passing yards, the most rushing yards by a non-running back or receiver in college football, over 1,200 rushing yards last year. Those numbers were not there for J.J. McCarthy and Michael Penix, but don't kid yourself. These two guys were 2 of the best quarterbacks in the country. Penix was first in passing yards. He was 14th in yards per attempt. McCarthy was actually slightly better, 10th overall, averaging 9 yards per attempt. Penix had 36 touchdowns through the air. That was the 3rd most. And then you look at the completion rate. McCarthy was 4th in the country, 72.1%, a respectable 65.5% for Michael Penix when you consider a big part of that passing game for Washington was downfield explosives. That's a really good completion rate for the style offense they ran. Both these guys in the top 20 in NFL passer rating for college quarterbacks. And in the case of McCarthy, he was more of a threat running the football, though Penix is capable. He had 3 rushing touchdowns. I think that these are the 2 quarterbacks that if the Seahawks are going to be making a move with Geno Smith, we don't know what's going to happen on that front right now. I think the Seahawks are going to have a difficult time getting quality value back in return for him. And he still has a contract that even though his cap hit triples this year, it is still a fairly team-friendly deal for a quality starting quarterback. So I don't know that any move is happening on that front. And Geno Smith could very well be on the roster, and the Seahawks use that 16th overall pick on one of these quarterbacks. But the fact that they continue to bring in assistants that have links to several of these quarterbacks, whether it's a coincidence or not, they're going to have a lot of intel that some of the other teams in the league do not have on these certain prospects. If they are considering drafting a QB, I know John Schneider for a few years has had that itch to draft a quarterback. And now that he is in full command of personnel decisions with Pete Carroll being in an advisory role, if that's really what's going on, John Schneider's got all the keys of the kingdom now to get that quarterback if he wants to. And now he's got some extra voices in the room to help him make that decision that have been on staff with these players. So I do think that it increases the chances a little bit that they're going to be looking at one of these quarterbacks. They may already have a couple of them on the radar as we draw close to the draft. Free agency coming up. What happens with Geno Smith? There's a lot of dominoes that are going to have to happen here or go down in the next couple of months to really know what's going to happen. But I do think, and some fans may think that this is not a big deal at all. These guys are getting hired for different reasons. But I do think that John Schneider and Mike Macdonald are looking for some coaches that also have that intel. They got a lot of guys that have recently been at the college ranks so they can help out with the draft, particularly at the quarterback position. So we shall see what happens. But I do find this intriguing that they have continued to add these coaches who have worked with these top quarterbacks that are in this incoming draft class. And I think that there may be some reasoning behind that. And we'll find out when we get to late April. Obviously, with the combine coming up next week, things are going to start heating up on the draft front. Up next, speaking of Zach Hill, he's one of 5 reported coaches that have been added to the Seahawks coaching staff here in the last 48 hours. I'm going to be diving into a number of these reported candidates and looking at where they fit in Seattle, their past track record, and much more. I'll be getting that next here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Now for a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Life can be full of twists and turns, and it can throw a few wrenches at you when you least expect it. So it's important to lead yourself through it all and make sure to put a focus on your mental health. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs, and they can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. Therapy worked wonders for me this last year when I was dealing with family-related health issues, including for my wife. But don't just take my word for it. Having someone in your corner to guide you when you're struggling to navigate obstacles can be invaluable. This isn't just a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. With therapy, it can take a few tries to find the right fit for you. BetterHelp is a great way to invest in yourself, and BetterHelp has a special offer for our listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. And don't forget to check out Locked On's first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here to offer you 24/7 coverage of the top sports stories of the day with local experts from Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. The Seahawks continue to add coaches to their staff, and with the combine coming up next week in Indianapolis, I anticipate that we will get a finalized coaching staff here in the next couple of days as they try to turn the page towards other offseason stuff. 5 reported hirings in the last 48 hours that we haven't had a chance to really dive into here on the podcast. And the first one that I want to dive into is actually a coach who has been on my radar for a while. He comes originally from the Leslie Frazier coaching tree. He worked for Mike Zimmer most of his time in Minnesota, but first NFL opportunity for Jeff Howard happened in 2013 with Leslie Frazier, who is now the Seahawks assistant head coach. So there's obviously the ties there. But this is a guy that has a really interesting resume. Even though he has not been with very many teams in the league, he had a very long stint in Minnesota from 2013 to 2019 as an assistant coach. That was after being at Texas Tech, where he actually was an assistant O-line coach and worked with defensive backs. That's quite an interesting combination, even for a college coach at the Division I level. That caught the attention of Leslie Frazier. He goes to Minnesota. Frazier, unfortunately, is fired after one season, but Mike Zimmer comes in and he keeps Jeff Howard on the staff all the way through the 2019 season. Minnesota had some pretty good defenses during that time and made the playoffs a number of times with Jeff Howard on that staff. And then he goes to Cleveland. 2020, the defense struggles a little bit, but as a defensive back coach and pass game coordinator in 2021 and 2022, Cleveland finished 5th best in the league in total passing defense both of those seasons. Some of that had to do with that pass rush that Myles Garrett and company bring to the equation, but still, Jeff Howard had back-to-back years where he was able to put together one of the top elite passing game defenses in the league in Cleveland. And then last year with the Chargers, he goes out to LA and becomes the linebacker coach to work for Brandon Staley, and that ended up being a lame duck situation. But don't blame it on Howard. This is a guy that can absolutely coach a number of positions. He has that O-line background previously. He's worked with DBs, linebackers. It sounds like DB is going to be where he's going to be working at, primarily with the Seahawks, as an assistant for Leslie Frazier. And the passing game coordinator, Carl Scott, the one holdover from Pete Carroll's staff that Mike Macdonald has retained. So they're building a nice set of experienced coaches in the secondary that also brings some versatility to their defensive coaching staff. Another coach that I anticipate is going to get some work in the DB area. Maybe he will help with receivers as well. Nick Perry. And this is a player who actually starred for Nick Saban at Alabama, briefly was in the NFL, but wasn't able to translate from being a top-tier college player to being an NFL standout, and promptly moved into the coaching ranks back at Alabama with Nick Saban. Kirby Smart was there at that point. He's a grad assistant for a couple of years. He did defensive analyst for a couple of years, which that is a big title on Nick Saban's defense. And then he jumps to the NFL the last few years. He was an assistant defensive back coach for 2 years. that fits his natural position. He was a safety for the Crimson Tide in his brief time in the NFL. And then last year, he was coaching receivers as an assistant with the Falcons. So Perry's a really intriguing case. This could be one of those guys where at this point, we don't really know where the puzzle fits, the puzzle piece fits in here. They have a number of other coaches that are supposed to be helping out with DBs. At some point, I would think that they're going to be looking for some assistance at other positions. And because Perry coached receivers last year in Atlanta, that may very well be a spot the Seahawks envision him coming in and helping Frisman Jackson at that spot. But he could also be involved with DBs. He could be one of those coaches that has a couple different hats that he wears in an assistant role. But this is a young coach that still is in his early 30s, has an opportunity to work his way up to a passing game coordinator at some point if he wants to, and maybe a defensive coordinator at some point. So we've seen Mike Macdonald hire a number of coaches that fit that bill. And as I mentioned in the first segment, Zach Hill, let's get to Zach Hill for a moment, because this is a coach that has a very fascinating track record compared to some of the others that we've looked at, because this guy seemed to be on a fast track to being a Division I head coach. He was at Eastern Washington for a number of years. In fact, 7 seasons at Eastern Washington as their passing game coordinator and QB coach. So there may be a lot of fans on the eastern side of Washington who are familiar with Zach Hill. He had a good run at Eastern Washington. He turned that into the offensive coordinator and quarterback coach job at Boise State. He was with the Broncos for 4 years. The first season, he was a co-offensive coordinator, and then he became the sole offensive coordinator his last 3 years in Boise. And he turned that into an even bigger offensive coordinator, quarterback coach job working for Herm Edwards at Arizona State. That is where he coached Jaden Daniels as one of the top recruits in the country for the Sun Devils. And when things fell apart on Herm Edwards' staff with some of the NCAA yellow tape that was there and some of the probations that were being thrown down, that entire staff was sent packing. And rather than go to another college at the Division I level, Zach Hill actually went back to high school. And last year, he coached Saguaro High School in Arizona, and they ended up winning a championship. So this is a coach that took a very different path. He was escalating up the ladder, going from FCS to a non-Power 5 school to a Power 5 program in the Pac-12 conference as an OC and a quarterback coach. And then when things flamed out, instead of going back to a bigger school, he ended up going back down to the high school level where he originally started his coaching career. Now he's jumping past college back to the NFL, and he's going to be there to provide assistance for Charles London. I'm anticipating with his background that he is going to be heavily involved with whichever quarterbacks the Seahawks have. And so I'm fascinated to see where he fits in on this staff, considering that very unique journey where a lot of times you see coaches when they flame out in a place in college, they typically stay at that level. Maybe they go to a lower level of college, but you don't see many coaches do that path where they go back to high school before eventually jumping back into college, or in this case, the NFL. So very unique experiences there for Zach Hill. And the fact he's coached Jaden Daniels, maybe that does have a bearing on what the Seahawks are hoping to do. But this is a guy that's coached a number of really good quarterbacks at the college level. He's coached in the Pac-12. He's been an offensive coordinator for a number of years in big-time college football. So anytime you can add a guy like that as an assistant for Ryan Grubb, Charles London, and the rest of this offensive staff, I think this is a quality hire. As for the other two hires that were made by the Seahawks, Justin Hines will be jumping on as the defensive line coach. And the last 2 years, he was the assistant defensive line coach for the Bears. I find it interesting to see what Montez Sweat did after the Commanders traded into the Bears last year. Hines had a lot of involvement with their edge defenders on the defensive line, and the Bears got good production in the second half of the season, led by Montez Sweat. So this has been an ascending coach that's actually been in the league for 12 years. Now he gets a chance to be a D-line coach working with Adam Durde, who's got a defensive line background. He's the defensive coordinator. He's now going to be entrusting Justin Hines to handle that. And then Mack Brown, not the one that coached at Texas and currently is at North Carolina. He's not coming to join the Seahawks staff, but from the New York Jets, Mack Brown, the last 5 years, was with the Jets. He was a defensive coach the first 2 years in New York under Adam Gase. And then when Robert Saleh came in as the new head coach, he retained Mack Brown as an offensive coach. He has been an offensive coordinator at the college level at Missouri State. So you have another guy on your staff that previously has play calling experience. He's going to be tasked with coaching the tight ends for the Seattle Seahawks. And so you're bringing in a guy that's got a number of unique experiences. He also was a recruiting coordinator before becoming a coach at Missouri in the SEC. So he's coached at a number of different levels, a number of different positions, and now he gets to cut his teeth in Seattle coaching the tight end position. We'll see which of these hires, if all of them, ends up coming true. Sometimes you see these reported hires, the Seahawks end up making a different decision. Other teams make different decisions, but I'm anticipating that all these will be officially announced here in coming days with the combine coming up. Up next, one of the big hires that Mike Macdonald made for the Seahawks coaching staff. He swung for the fences, reeling in Ryan Grubb, former Washington offensive coordinator, former Alabama offensive coordinator for about 5 minutes, was able to reel him in to call plays for the Seahawks. And a lot of people are wondering what his run game is going to look like at the pro level. I'm going to be taking a deep dive into what Ryan Grubb's run game has looked like the last 5 years as a college offensive coordinator, what may translate to the league, and what I expect is going to be different after watching a number of his college games the last couple of years on All 22. We'll get to that here in a moment on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, such as who's going to make the first basket on Thursday night. Live games, same game parlays, including LeBron James and Anthony Davis, potentially each scoring 25 points in the Lakers' first game out of the All-Star break, and exclusive props, such as King James, how he's going to score his 40,000th point. That's a lot of points, and much more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. You're listening to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to each and every one of the 12s tuning in on this Thursday afternoon. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The Seahawks swung for the fences with their offensive coordinator position rather than bringing in someone who had past experience as an offensive coordinator at the NFL level, like, say, for example, Frank Reich or an Eric Bieniemy. They decided to go for a bit of an unknown, at least from NFL terms, bringing Ryan Grubb back to the Pacific Northwest. Grubb was slated to be Alabama's offensive coordinator, going with Kalen DeBoer to the Crimson Tide, but all along he has had interest in the NFL. Mike Macdonald came calling with this offensive coordinator position for him in the league. First opportunity for him to be a play caller at the NFL level, and he jumped at his opportunity. And Grubb has made it clear, even though Washington the last 2 years, the Huskies had one of the most explosive offenses in college football built around the passing game, the run game is also going to be incredibly important for him at the next level. And I think this is maybe the biggest question mark when it comes to Ryan Grubb. You know what to expect from his passing games. They have an emphasis on attacking deep downfield. You're going to see a lot of pre-snap motion to create matchups, open up space. You're going to see a lot of screens, and they're very effective at running them. So the passing game, it feels like there's a lot more that can translate to the next level, at least what you expect to see. I think with the run game, though, there really is some fascination here because you don't necessarily know what Ryan Grubb's offense is going to look like in the pros compared to what it was at the college level, particularly in the run game and how they're going to deploy their formations. First, I want to start with the basics here because when you look at the last 5 years, and I have watched a lot of film the last few days on Washington Huskies football in 2022 and 2023, trying to get a grasp on what the run game looked like for Ryan Grubb in Montlake. And both seasons were quite different, to be honest. But I also went back and looked at some data from his 3 years as the offensive coordinator at Fresno State in the Mountain West Conference, where he had another very pass-heavy attack in those 3 years with the Bulldogs. So the track record in the last 5 years has been leaning towards a pass-heavy offense, but he has consistently had efficient running football teams to complement that passing game. And so when you look at his scheme over the last 5 years as a college coordinator, It's interesting. His 3 seasons at Fresno State, we're talking almost 70% zone concepts. So your inside zones, outside zones, mid zones, split zones, all of those zone concepts. Fresno State ran almost 70% of the time in their run game in the 3 years that he was with the program. And then his first year at Washington, that trend continued. The Huskies ran almost 69% of their run plays were zone concepts. This past season, Ryan Grubb and his staff threw a curveball, though, and they went the other direction. It was the first time in his offensive coordinator career that his team was north of 50%. And according to Pro Football Focus, they were at 54.4% gap runs and only 45.6% zone runs. And I kind of batted my eye when I saw this information before I went in and started watching film, because I thought there's no way there was this stark of a difference when you had a lot of the same players on the roster from one year to the next. And as I started to really dive into the film, though, it became apparent when comparing the 2022 Huskies offense to the 2023 Huskies offense that this indeed was the case. They scrapped that zone-heavy run game, and they really went after it with counters, power runs, traps this past season. You just saw a much different looking run game. It was still effective. It still packed a punch. Dylan Johnson had a monster season after coming over from Mississippi State. And the offensive line was really a key part of that. This is a group that's going to have as many as 3 offensive linemen that have a chance to be drafted in April. So this is a group that really was the leader of this offense, their offensive line, protecting Michael Penix and in the ground game. And so they did lean a lot more heavily on that gap scheme, in particular in the few games that I was able to watch in full, all 22, including the Pac-12 championship game against Oregon. In that game, the bread and butter really emerged. It was the counter tray play where Washington had both a guard and tackle from the opposite side of the play pulling out in space across the formation. And this was a common theme for Washington last year. They sent their guards and tackles and even their center pulling frequently. They like to get their linemen out in space, and they were athletic enough to be able to do it. These guys shot out like sprinters coming out of their stance, going out on pulling assignments. And when they got their hands on guys, they brought them to the ground consistently. So this was a very effective strategy for this football team with the personnel they had. And that counter tray play, Oregon had all kinds of trouble stopping it. The Utah game, even the Utes with their stingy defense, they gave up a couple big plays on counter trays with 2 pulling guard and tackles going opposite direction. And they did it out of shotgun and pistol. So that gave me a little bit more of an idea what an under center look with this schematically may look like. Pistol looks, I still think, are going to be a significant part of Ryan Grubb's offense. I just expect that there's going to be a bit more under center when he comes to Seattle than what we saw at Washington with the Huskies, where they were primarily a shotgun team for most of their plays on offense. As far as my thoughts coming out of watching the 7 full games that I looked at from 2022 and 2023, the first big thing, as I mentioned, they primarily ran the ball from shotgun pistol sets for the Huskies. I don't expect that trend to continue in Seattle. Now, do I expect this team is suddenly going to be running a Sean McVay offense where they're under center most of the time? No, I don't. But I expect that we are going to see a more balanced offense formationally where the quarterback is going to be under center more, and that's going to be part of the driving force with the run game. I also expect some carryover from what we saw this past season. Now, I'm not saying that the Seahawks are suddenly going to be a 60% gap team, and maybe they will be. We saw last year that Ryan Grubb is capable of dialing up the gap run game and being just as effective as the zone run game that really was the pinnacle of his rushing offense in his first 4 seasons as a coordinator at Fresno State and at Washington. But he showed he can turn a new leaf. And so I expect some of those concepts, particularly with personnel, whatever Seattle ends up doing personnel-wise is going to dictate this. But if they bring back Damian Lewis, for example, that is going to be telling to me that this is going to be a team that's going to be more of a balanced run game that isn't going to be leaning zone heavy. Not that Damian Lewis can't block inside-outside zone because he's capable, but he is at his best when he gets his hand in the dirt, fires out of stance, and gets downhill on guys. So, and he's also a really good pulling guard. I anticipate that if that move is made, that is going to be an indication that this run game is going to lean more heavily on those gap concepts. If they use the draft or free agency to bring in some lighter, more athletic guards, a center, then I anticipate that you're going to see more of the zone game. I do think the personnel decisions are going to carry a lot of weight here because the Seahawks right now, they're 3 interior O-line starters from last year, at least projected for the start of the season. All 3 of them are free agents: Evan Brown, Phil Haynes, and Lewis, as I mentioned. So there could be a lot of turnover in the middle. That may be a position, with this being a really good draft at the guard center positions, that could be a position at pick number 16. Maybe somebody like Jackson Powers Johnson from Oregon would make sense at that selection, and you can plug him in at center or guard in your offense as a day one starter. You know, those kind of moves are going to dictate what this offense is going to look like schematically. And so I think that's really the big picture here. Ryan Grubb has shown at the college level, just the last 2 years in Washington, that he can have very different looking run games schematically and still have plenty of punch and provide that balance that you're looking for that can really open things up for the passing game. For the Seahawks, it's really going to boil down to what that personnel looks like, the decisions they make in free agency, who they bring back, if they bring in any players from other teams, what they choose to do with the draft. All of those decisions are going to end up playing into this. And I do think that they've already got some pieces of the tackle spots, assuming Abe Lucas is able to rebound from that injury-plagued sophomore season. Charles Cross made some improvements this past year, and he fits what Ryan Grubb likes to do. So I'm really interested to see what happens in the interior O-line. That is going to have a lot of bearing on what this run game ends up looking like. But I saw a coordinator that was able to create rhythm and flow with his offense with both the passing and run game in a variety of ways. Just looking at what he did the last 2 years at Washington. And so that shows the ability to adapt, shows the ability to adjust to personnel. So once we have a better idea what this O-line is going to look like personnel-wise, what type of players that they have, what their strengths are, I think that Ryan Grubb is then going to be able to really dive in and figure out what he expects this run game to look like, what his goal is schematically to go with the passing game that he's going to be looking to build in Seattle. So there's going to be a bit of intrigue. There's some unknowns there, but I'm encouraged by the fact that even though this has been a team that has slung the ball all over the place at Washington, this has still been an effective rushing football team. They've been efficient. They've been able to rack up a lot of yards. Big games like that championship game against Oregon, they were able to have over 130 rushing yards in that game. When they needed to run the football, they typically found ways to get it done, and they did it in different ways. That is what excites me going into his first NFL offensive coordinator job. We shall see what happens. We'll have to get a better idea what this personnel grouping is going to look like. But this is a run game that has a chance to be really fun to watch with Ken Walker III and Zach Charbonnet, different styles, and you got a coordinator that I believe has the adaptability to be able to maximize both those players and really get more out of the offensive line than what we've seen in recent seasons. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow on Blue Friday, we're going to dive more into free agency, Devin Bush being our spotlight player. I'll be joined by Nick Lee, and we might have some other organizational stuff that we'll be tackling for this offseason, maybe putting together some agendas for what the Seahawks should be doing here with free agency just around the corner. Going to be a jam-packed episode. Make sure you're listening in, and thanks for tuning in to today's show. Go Hawks.